Professor. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a member of the British Museum Youth Collective. Today, I'm joined by two members of staff from the British Museum, Stuart and Fabiana, for a discussion about change at the British Museum, what changes the last 6 months have brought, and what the future might bring. Before we get into some questions, I'm going to ask Stuart and Fabiana to briefly introduce themselves and their roles at the British Museum. Fabiana, can I come to you first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So my name is Fabiana Portoni. I'm a preventive conservator for the museum. And just to explain a little bit about my role, so conservation can be divided into two main branches. One branch is kind of interventive or remedial conservation, which is actual treatment on the object. So cleaning, consolidation, actual direct work on the objects. And then preventive conservation, where we try to prevent damage from happening. And we do this by mitigating any agents that could cause damage to the collection. So what are these agents? It could be either incorrect environmental conditions, pests, pollutants such as particulates, dust, or gaseous pollutants and light, etc. How do we do this across the museum, such a big organization? So it's not just me and my team, but it's working collaboratively with colleagues in facilities, visitor services, like across the whole site for it to actually work.
My name is Stuart Frost. I'm head of interpretation and volunteers at the museum. My pronouns are he, him. And I've basically got two sides to my job, but they're both ultimately about helping people make sense of the collection. So I often get asked by people, what does interpretation mean? And it's basically anything across the museum that helps people make sense of their visit. But primarily it's my role's involved in developing permanent gallery displays, special exhibitions. So it's really helping people make sense of the collection. And in order to do that, we do quite a lot of visitor research. So an important part of the interpretation role is knowing about visitors, knowing how people behave during a visit to the museum, what interests them, what their motivations are, and taking those things into account. So that's the interpretation side of my role. And then I'm also head of volunteers, and the museum is really fortunate to have an incredible team of volunteers for aged 18 upwards, from 18 to 80 plus. And really about 300 of those volunteers are involved in public facing roles in the museum. So every day they give gallery talks ordinarily. Obviously at the moment we're in a very different situation, so there isn't any volunteering happening at the moment, unfortunately. But normally there is. And in addition to gallery talks, there are 8 hands-on desks that the volunteers look after, so people can handle objects from the collection, ask questions about them, that sort of thing.
Thank you so much for those introductions. So my first set of questions is about the pandemic. So what have been the main challenges over the last 6 months?
It's been quite a 6 months, hasn't it? So in terms of challenges, I mean, one of the big challenges really was on the 18th of March, the museum essentially closed to the public. So this whole process of having to close the museum down, which brought with it particular challenges and so on. And it just, but in terms of personally, for me and my team, a big change was just working from home, basically. So on the 18th of March, it was the last day we were in the office. At the end of the day, we sort of said goodbye to each other, and we headed off home with as much stuff as we could carry in our bags to make sure we had what we needed at home. And then we just sort of had to adapt to working remotely and working on things like exhibitions and gallery projects. And normally they involve a lot of face-to-face conversations, often fueled by cups of tea, and it's quite a social thing. And it's obviously more difficult to do that. So we all had to just get used to working remotely and to mastering Zoom and Teams and things that most of us hadn't really been engaging with before. So that was definitely a big challenge. And then about a month later, a large number of staff in the museum were placed on furlough leave. And again, that was a really big change. So I normally work with my team. There are 10 people in the team, and all of those people were furloughed on the 17th of April. And that was a process that sort of happened quite quickly. And then again, so we had to get used to, working with, different people, a few people in the museum, and some of the tasks changed. We obviously reached the point where we started to plan for reopening the museum. And at that point, a whole set of new working groups of staff from across the museum were sort of pulled together to start planning for that. And that was actually, it was challenging. It's quite exciting as well, a different way of working. I can't remember the exact timelines now, but we probably had about 8 weeks of detailed work leading up to the reopening of the museum on the 27th of August. So it was quite intense.
That's great. And I'm going to ask some more questions about reopening later. But first, Fabiana, do you want to tell us a bit about the challenges of the last 6 months for you?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges for us in kind of collection care was that we had plans for all these different scenarios, but we didn't have a plan for how to care for the collection in a pandemic. So it made us think and just threw us off guard. But it's been a great experience because we've had to just, think outside the box and care for the collection in a different way. As Stuart mentioned, it was quite challenging because in collection care, we need collaboration with a lot of colleagues and going around and checking kind of in stores, collection stores and in galleries. And we couldn't do that so much. A lot of colleagues were on furlough. We were discouraged from going on site unless we really needed to. So we had to care for the collection remotely as much as possible. And so that was quite different.
And I actually wanted to ask a little bit more about the impact on the museum collection of the museum being closed. So kind of like if objects had to go into storage or stuff like that.
Yeah, of course. So we have a lot of objects that are quite vulnerable to changes in environmental conditions, or they just require very specific environmental conditions. So their cases, whilst they're on display, they have either dehumidifiers, humidifiers, or kind of complex microclimate machines that make sure that the conditions stay stable. But during lockdown, because there was no public and we didn't have as many people checking these machines, we thought, would it be a better idea just to decant these objects, move them into collection storage areas where we're already controlling the conditions for all the other objects, and kind of turn these machines off and use less energy. One particular case linked to this is the Louis Chessmen, which is a group of fantastic objects in the collection. The Louis Chessmen are normally in Gallery 40, in case 5, which is a case in the middle of the gallery. If next time you are in the museum, check them out if you haven't already, they're great. But the Louis Chessmen are made mainly of walrus ivory, and a few are made of sperm whale teeth. And this type of material is very vulnerable to changes in environmental conditions. So their case has a microclimate machine that makes sure the conditions are stable. And whilst we were discussing whether to decant them and move them to a store or not, the sensor that monitors that case, the battery died as we were discussing. So, that was kind of the decision. We had to go change the battery, but we might as well decant the Louis Chessmen and move them to a store where they could be with other ivory objects in very stable conditions. So they were happily there during lockdown and then returned to their case now.
So on the subject of collection and actually moving parts of the collection, a few days before the reopening of the museum, there was a lot in the news about the portrait bust of Hannah Sloan. So this is the man whose collection became the founding collection of the museum and whose collection was, at least in part, financed by the labour of enslaved West Africans in Jamaica. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what's happened with the bust.
Over the summer, obviously there were the Black Lives Matter protests in response to the death of George Floyd. And in the UK, like a sort of pivotal moment in those protests was the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. Edward Colston had these sort of intimate links with the slave trade. And I guess that provoked a lot of interest in statues, in heritage sites, museums across the country. And at the museum, we were keen in response to all of the protests and the activity to reinterpret, to have a look it's to tell Sloane's story more effectively than it was being told in the gallery that the bust was in. So basically, the bust there's a bust of Hannah Sloan in the Enlightenment Gallery, which is room 1 at the museum, which focuses on the 18th century, and it's a sort of very atmospheric gallery that sort of evokes the way museums looked in the 18th century, and it's got fairly minimal labeling, because museums in the 18th and 19th century didn't really have labels, so the early British Museum didn't. And the bust of Sloan is this really key figure in the founding of the museum. He was in the gallery, but he just had, like all the other busts of the great and the good in that gallery, he just had his name on it and his dates. It didn't really tell a very meaningful story for most people about Sloane's role in the founding of the museum and how he collected and his connections to the slave trade. So what we wanted to do was to move Sloan into a case in the gallery so that we could put a more nuanced, richer story around him. So a group of curators were pulled together to develop a new display looking at Sir Hannah Sloan and his connection with the British Empire and his connection with the slave trade. And so a range of other objects were brought into that case to talk about those things, like links to the empire and the slave trade. So to give a little more background to that, so Sloan was he began his career as a physician to the governor of Jamaica, and at the time Jamaica was a British colony. And while Sloan's on Jamaica, he's collecting natural history specimens and so on, and as you say, drawing on the knowledge of enslaved people who knew more about the plants and what they could be used for. And so within the case, there's a copy of one of the volumes that Sloan published. He sort of published this big book about the natural history of Jamaica, so the book's in the case. But there are other objects there that look at the sort of wider context of the slave trade. So, for example, there's a seal matrix for a company called the Royal Africa Company, which was founded under sort of royal patronage. And the Royal Africa Company basically trades in slaves. And there was a company that Hannah Sloan invested in, like other 18th century, wealthy 18th century people. So yeah, it was basically developed to tell the story of Sloan and his relationship with the transatlantic slave trade and how that relates to the museum and his collecting.
Fabiana, in the context of preventative conservation, what are the different considerations when a bust is on a plinth, so like in the open, versus when it's put into a case?
So actually, it's much easier to go from an object being on open display to a case. In this case, the bust is terracotta, so it's not as vulnerable as, for example, the Louis Chessmen that definitely need to go on a case. But when they're on open display, they're more vulnerable to dust deposition, kind of less stable environmental conditions. So going into the case, that's always fine for conservation purposes. Going out of the case, if it was an object that is very vulnerable to changes in environment or really vulnerable to pests, that would be a bit trickier. We might not be so happy when an object goes out of the case, but into the case, that's fine.
Talking about kind of changes in narratives told about objects, I know about a trail, so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the changes that we might be able to see when we're visiting the museum now that have happened regarding narratives told about objects. Yeah,
one of the big changes in terms of the visitor experience at the moment is that this is a one-way route around the museum. So, previously people could go into the museum and go wherever they wanted, 6 floors. And at the moment, there's a one-way route that's primarily around the ground floor of the museum. And that's quite, from an interpretation point of view, I find that quite exciting. There's an opportunity to sort of curate the visit a little bit more and present new stories and new information in a slightly different way. And one of the things that we developed to go along the one-way route for opening was a trail highlighting, it's around 15 objects, and it's called Collecting an Empire. And there's a lot of interest, I think, at the moment from the public about how museum collections come together, how objects leave their home country and end up in a museum. And I think there's also a lot of interest in the relationship between the British Empire and collecting and so on. So the trail is an attempt to open up to highlight some key objects across the collection that give a little bit of insight into the sort of relationships between empire and collecting. So that, as I say, 15 objects across the one-way route. And when you get to the object, we've put expanded interpretation there. So everyone will be used to going to a museum and get, sort of 60-word standard label. And for these objects, because their story is a bit more complicated and you can't tell it in such a condensed format, we've put a bigger piece of interpretation. And so the first part of it talks about the object itself and how it was collected, how it came to be in the museum. And then the second part of the text talks about the relationship between the source country and the British Empire, to sort of give it a sort of sense of the history of the British Empire.
Could you tell us about an example of one of the objects on the trail, maybe?
Well, I think in relation to Hannah Sloan, I think maybe it's interesting if I talk about an object called the Akan drum, which is in the North America gallery at the museum. And the drum was actually part of Hannah Sloan's collection. So it came into the museum in 1753. What we know about the drum was that it was collected in Virginia at a time in North America. It's now the United States, but at the time it was a British colony. And the drum was collected by a reverend, we don't know exactly how. And it comes into Hannah Sloan's collection. He thinks it's a North American drum, a native North American drum. But actually, we now know that it's a drum from West Africa, and it's an Akan drum, a drum made by the Akan people, and then it probably almost certainly crossed the Atlantic on board a slave ship. So it was part of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's a very powerful object. It's the earliest African-American object in the museum's collection, so we wanted to highlight it as part of the trail because it has such a powerful, important, relevant story to tell.
So this new trail is something that visitors have seen since the reopening. And I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about the lead up to the reopening. So like how you guys felt about the reopening. Was it quite daunting or exciting?
It was exciting in a way because it's a one-way system. And we had to, for health and safety considerations, we had to increase the ventilation. We had to do things a little bit differently. So we had to open some windows, open some doors, and also have these big fans in the galleries. So before doing this, before the actual opening, I had a walk around with colleagues from other departments to make sure that we were increasing the ventilation, but also we weren't changing the environmental conditions that could be a risk to the objects. And also because we had fans in areas that we wouldn't normally, we were creating new air currents, and this could affect dust deposition. So we were also monitoring dust deposition in areas that we wouldn't normally have dust. So yeah, it was exciting to look at the galleries in a different way and check that the conditions were still okay.
Did you have any kind of problems like with the galleries that are still closed? Are there could they not suddenly be opened? Did you have to do quite a lot of prep before you can open to the public?
Yeah, we do have to do a lot of prep, especially for this ventilation scheme. We all have to agree on the place of the different locations of the fans, which windows are safe to open that could be closed if, for example, it starts raining. So yeah, we can't just open the gallery and open the ventilation. We do need to do a bit of planning. From my end, I'm sure Stuart has other considerations.
And from my point of view, yeah, it was really exciting time, really exciting thing to work on because we're a big organization and sometimes it takes a time to deliver a project. Like normally, some of the projects I work on, they take years of planning to deliver. And so for me, it was quite exciting because we had 8 or 9 weeks to do something, and everything had to happen quite quickly. So yeah, that was really an exciting aspect to it, and it gave us a little bit of a chance to experiment with things, to do things differently. And yeah, I also got to work with people that I wouldn't necessarily work with in the same sort of way, because there was so many people involved in getting the museum open and making that one-way route work. Visitor services staff, and making sure we had the right number of people in the right places to support it all. Yeah, it was yeah, pretty exciting.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit. This is looking to the future now. About plans to reopen further rooms, because I know it's quite limited at the moment, and generally like what the next steps are for the museum.
Yeah, so we do have plans to open other galleries, especially kind of a chunk of the upper galleries like the mummies. We are working across different departments to get that ready. Again, because of the ventilation the ventilation regulations, we need to consider that conservation and collection care wise.
We basically had a phased plan, and as you move through the phases, more and more of the museum becomes open. So phase 1 was August the 27th, and it was basically just the ground floor of the museum and a one-way route. And we're in sort of phase 3 now, where one of the exhibitions is open and another special exhibition opens later this month. So we have a plan basically to, as we can, to open up, as Fabiana says, other parts of the museum, including the ancient Egyptian displays upstairs, which have mummies in them, which are very popular with visitors. So that's the next sequence of galleries that will open, but then more will follow.
So this is a bit of a kind of behind the scenes question, but I wanted to ask about staff. Are you guys back in the museum? I can see obviously you're not at the moment, but are many staff back in offices, or who's back on site?
Yeah, so I am back on site some days, and then some days I work from home. And then a lot of colleagues in conservation that are working with the objects, like they do their object work, and then the rest of the week, if they have to do computer work, they do it at home. Collections management staff, they're also on site, but I know that there's some people on flexible furlough, so they work and then they're on furlough 1 week. So there's a lot of, depending on your role, there's different, but we are a little bit more in now, not like pure lockdown when we couldn't go in. So we do go in and out, but we still try to balance it.
And from my point of view, I'm generally, and my team, most of my team is back from furlough now, but we're working from home on the exhibitions, unless we have to come in for a specific reason. And sometimes you have to go and see something in the exhibition space to check and make sure it works. But mostly Zoom and Teams works pretty well, so we can do a lot of it remotely, but sometimes we have to go in. Yeah.
Are there plans for when you might have volunteers back on site?
Yeah, good question. There are, yes. The volunteers are really obviously super enthusiastic. It's been a long time since they've been on site, so they're really keen to get going again. So if the quick answer is, I think early 2021 we'll start to resume volunteering on site. I think before then, I'm hoping that we'll be able to do some small pilots just to test and learn, and to get feedback from the volunteers to make sure they feel comfortable with the measures that are in place and that they feel it's working with the public. So hopefully some pilot projects before Christmas, and then as we progress through 2021, the program will gradually pick up, and so hopefully we have all 500 people back.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm excited for the future then. I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you, Stuart and Fabiana, for joining me today and having this really interesting discussion. It's great to hear from both of you and kind of get an insight to the museum's work behind the scenes. I want to say thank you to everyone who's watching. Don't forget to check out other events by the British Museum Youth Collective, both this week and in the future.